G'day legends. In this video, we are going to finally put a rest to cymbal bleed in drums. I'm going to show you 3 plugins that are awesome at killing cymbal bleed. And if you're still having issues with cymbal bleed after you watch this video, then the problem is not with the plugins you're using, the problem is with the performance. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So I've got 3 plugins here that I think are really great at killing cymbal bleed. We've got 2 plugins from FabFilter. We've got ProMB and we've got Saturn 2, and then we've got Blackshot Audio's silencer. These 3 plugins are all you need to eliminate or at least control cymbal bleed substantially to get yourself a nice clean drum recording. So I've set up a bit of a test here. We can compare these 3 plugins and you guys can decide which one sounds the best to you. But in my opinion, all 3 of them are indispensable tools that are really good at what they do. And depending on the circumstance, really determines which one of these I reach for when trying to deal with cymbal bleed. So let's jump into it. Here's the track that I'm going to be demonstrating this with. Okay, so it sounds pretty good at the moment. We already have a plugin on here killing our cymbal bleed. This is what it would sound like without anything dealing with the cymbal bleed. That sounds so horrible. You hear that psh, every time the snare hits, lets all the cymbals through. It sounds disgusting. So let's dive into it. Let's take a look at Saturn 2 to start with. So if you follow along Nolly Get Good, then you would know that this is something that he's shown before, and it's using Saturn 2 to kill cymbal bleed. And it's actually pretty interesting because this is a saturation plugin. So why does this work so well for killing cymbal bleed? Anyway, I don't have the answers for that, but it does work really good. So basically all you do is you make a band in here. So you can press the plus button up here and you just make a second band. On your first one, you just want to put the drive down to 0 because you're not really wanting to color the sound. We're just trying to control the cymbal bleed. And then on our second band over here, same thing, take the drive down to 0. I put it in linear phase mode just to avoid any kind of phase issues that could happen when sort of like playing with multiple bands here and then getting out of phase with the overheads and stuff like that. Just muck around, see what it sounds like. If you have it on and off, if you feel like it's fine without it, you don't need to use it. So here's the trick. In our high frequency band that we have over here on the right hand side, we're going to use the dynamics knob to control the cymbal bleed. So by pulling it down to the left, it's going to eliminate the cymbal bleed, but it's going to retain the overall attack and transient of the hits. And the other thing you want to play around with is where you set the band. At the moment, I've got it at 1,288 Hertz, but you can play around with where you put this to get different results and find that sweet spot to really rein in the cymbal bleed. You know, anywhere between like 1.2 to 1800 sounds pretty good. That's where you're starting to really rein in the cymbal bleed. Now you can hear we've got a bit of ghosting going on here. When the ghost notes come in, I've actually automated to bring the dynamics back up to let a little bit more of the ghost noting through. So you can see when we're over here, the dynamics is all the way down, and then as the ghost notes come in, the dynamics comes up and it's going to let it in. So have a little listen to that. So you can hear it's doing a really good job. We still get kind of that little like psh, psh sound when the snare hits, but in the context of the mix, it actually sounds fine. So you can hear it's working pretty good. It has a pretty natural sound about it. Pretty cool. So does this work on the kick as well? So I've set up a very similar thing on our bass drum. This is what it sounds like. Sounds pretty good. Does a really good job of keeping it sounding natural, pulling that bleed back, but it's not choking the drum either. And this isn't like a gate or anything. It's just actually just dealing with the cymbal bleed. Sounds pretty good to me. What about on toms? So what I've done is I've found a section where there's a lot of cymbal bleed in the toms to demonstrate this, to see how well it works. And what we've done is use some automation to let the dynamics through, so we get that initial hit and then we pull it back down straight away. So you can see before the toms hit, it's like flat line down the bottom, so that's where there is going to be all the bleed being choked out, and then we lift up that automation to let the transient through, and then we choke it back down. So let's see how this sounds on our toms. So it's okay. It's not like awesome, but it's doing a little something. You can hear it's way less on the end of the tail. Okay, so we've done the same for our floor tom as well. It's pretty good. Definitely these hits sound really clean. You can hear a little bit of cymbal bleed on the initial hit of this one. That little bit of sneaking through. To any ordinary listener, I don't know if they'd really pick up on that. But you and I, with our ear for details, we kind of hear that stuff and find it a little bit annoying. Okay, so that's kind of like what Saturn 2 is doing. That's pretty good. Like, it's not bad. For a saturation plugin to be able to deal with cymbal bleed like that, it's pretty cool. Now let's have a look at Black Salt Audio's silencer. So this is silencer on our kick. It's pretty good on the kick, like it really cleans it up. Playing with the length, letting as much rumble through as you want. The D bleeder as well. I don't feel like we need any of that though. You can hear as you push the D bleeder up, it kind of sucks a bit of the high end out of the sound as well. So I really try not to put too much D bleeder into these because I do feel like it chokes the sound of the drum off a little bit. And even adding EQ after, I don't feel like it really brings back what gets lost when you push this too far. And then the reduction, -40, just chokes it off nicely. Sounds tight. Solid choice for the kick. Let's have a look at the snare. Sounds pretty good. I've got the reduction at 0 because I want to let the sustain of the snare come through. Tiny little bit of D-bleed. The length isn't really doing anything because we've got no reduction, so that doesn't matter. This is also going to keep it honest when we compare it against Saturn 2 and ProMB in some direct comparisons, because neither of those are really gating the drum and dropping it down. So we don't really want any gating, otherwise that test kind of gets like cancelled out. But I also want the sustain of the drum, and then I'm using Shep's omni-channel anyway with a little bit of a gate afterwards. So we're kind of doing a little bit of that there. But overall, I want the drum to ring a little bit in this recording. Now we have ghost notes. The trick with silencer is that you automate on the ghost button. So I've done that for the verse here. We've got all those ghost notes rolling through. So that sounds all right. We get a bit of the nose. Let's hear it in the context of the mix. It's doing the job. You can hear a bit of that roll in there, which is good. Okay, now let's have a look at our toms with silencer. So we've just got the same settings for our rack and our floor tom. So this is just what the rack's on. Got a little bit of a D-bleed pushed up to about 40%. About 862 milliseconds on the length, and the reduction around -38, -40 dBs. It's definitely cleaning them up pretty well. What about this one over here? So doing a pretty awesome job on that one. All right, so silencer, kick, snare, and toms. So it's definitely doing a good job of tightening things up. Okay, now our other plugin, FabFilter ProMB. Let's check this one out. So we'll start with our kick. This is a really solid choice for getting rid of cymbal bleed as well. And all we have to do in this is make a single band, a high shelf. And then on that shelf, what we want to do is make it a really fast attack and a really fast release to start with. And then we're going to set the range to maybe around -15 to -30, anywhere there to kind of really rein in the cymbal bleed. And we're going to put it on expand mode. And you can play around with the knee to really like control how aggressive this works. I've got it pulled back a little bit. Then we open up the expert tab and we put it into free mode, which gives us this little band that sort of triggers the expander over here. So we can set which frequency range is going to make this bounce up. So by setting this band kind of in the sort of more mid-range area, getting rid of some of those ultra highs and ultra lows, helps it focus in a little bit more on the transient and trigger that gate correctly. So that sounds pretty good. You can pull the range down further if you want, really choke it off. Around 1800 Hertz sounded best just then for where this crossover point is. This is probably not my favorite choice for debleeding the kick, and to be honest, I rarely use a debleeder on the kick. Most of the time, it's not an issue when you have just a standard expander gate. But just to compare it with the test, it sounds all right, but I think the other two kind of did a better job than ProMB. All right, now let's check out our snare drum. Got the exact same settings, but this time we've got the release at around 13%. This just lets it hold on a little bit longer, lets through a little bit of the air of the snare. When you have it all the way down, it sort of sounds really choked. Even around 10% sounds good, just lets it hold it open a little bit longer just to let that air through. We don't really want to hear the psh psh, so the longer you hold the gate, the more you get that cymbal bleed that hangs around for a second, which is what we don't want. So just a little bit of release time sounds pretty good. The sweet spot seems to be around 1800 Hertz on drums with cymbal bleed. That's kind of where I like it. Okay, so let's check out the ghost notes now. So same deal, had to do a little bit of automation for this. So all I've done here is I've automated the range. So when the ghost notes come in, we're not letting it duck down as far. So we've only got about 4 to 5 dBs here of debleeding now happening compared to over here where we've got about 20 dBs of debleeding happening. So check out what happens here. Sounds pretty natural. It's got a pretty good sound about it. Really getting rid of those hi-hats really well. So great option on the snare. ProMB always works really well for that. Okay, let's check out ProMB on the toms. So this time we're just automating the threshold. So we've got it all the way at the top, so like nothing gets through. And then we're just bringing the threshold down to trigger on the initial hits of the tom transients. So it does a pretty good job of choking that off. Same with the floor tom. You hear that works pretty good, but it does still get a little bit of cymbal bleed in that initial hit. And that's why I chose that one, because it's got a lot of cymbal bleed in it. Okay, and 2 different tom hits over here. Works great. There's always going to be a couple of tricky hits on the toms where cymbal bleed rolls in and maybe the transient's just not punching enough, or there's just that much cymbal that you really can't get rid of it completely. But in the context of the mix, I think ProMB might be okay. Let's have a listen to what it sounds like. Pretty good. You can hear a little bit of that sound on this first one. So yeah, that kind of annoys me a little bit with ProMB. So maybe ProMB is not the best choice on the toms or the kick, but on the snare, it's pretty good. Okay, so now this is where we're going to put it to the test. We're going to compare all 3 of these back to back. Let's figure out which ones are the best. Okay, So pretty interesting. I think Silencer does the best on the toms. I actually really like the sound of Saturn 2 on the kick though, and ProMB on the snare sounded really good. So let's have a listen to this. We've got Saturn 2 on the kick, ProMB on the snare, and Silencer on the toms. All three plugins working together harmoniously to deliver excellent debleeding. That's why I don't really say one of these is the best. I just pick them for the circumstances and say, yeah, I like how these are working together. Let's have a listen to the bit with the ghost notes on the snare and compare which one handles ghost notes best. I actually think that Saturn 2 sounded the best on the ghost notes there, but overall I don't think Saturn 2 is quite as clean as the other two, but in the context of the mix, I think Saturn 2 still works really well. That little bit of cymbal bleed that's hanging around at the end of the hits, it's not really a problem in the context of the mix. It's pretty awesome. So you can see the problem here is they all have their strengths and weaknesses, and you have to decide what is best for the mix. And if you have a lot of ghost notes, I think maybe Saturn 2 is kind of a really good choice for dealing with cymbal bleed, but then also being able to let a more natural ghost noted sound through. Silencer sometimes sounds a little bit too like choppy on the ghost notes, and ProMB sounds alright, but it still kind of chokes the note off a little bit. Even when you bring that range down a touch, it's still basically like gating them down a little bit, which is not what you want. Whereas Saturn 2 sounds like it just lets it through, but it's just killing the cymbal bleed. So that's pretty cool. Let's just do one more comparison, just all close mics soloed, and we'll switch between the plugins. See how they work as a group dealing with cymbal bleed. Okay, so there you go. Pretty much any of those plugins works great. And if you have all three of them, you can mix and match and get the best results out of each of them, depending on the circumstances. And if you're still struggling with cymbal bleed, as I mentioned at the start of the video, the problem is probably not the plugins. The problem is the performance. If the drummer is smashing those cymbals, but they're not getting a strong transient through on your kick, snares, and toms, you're gonna have a lot of trouble getting these things to trigger correctly and deal with the issue. A really good drummer in the studio will mix themselves as they play. So that means they're going to play the cymbals in proportion to how hard they hit the drums. So you know, they're hitting their drums 110%, really laying in, getting some really strong hits, but maybe kind of backing off on the cymbals a little bit, maybe getting around like 80% energy into the cymbals. It's still going to sound really good, and it's going to work much better when you start mixing it, because cymbals just get into everything. So a drummer who can mix themselves, play the drums so they sound how they should sound level-wise, not kind of smashing the cymbals out of control, not hitting the drums loud enough, and then saying, here you go, fix this. It doesn't really work that well. And I know that when I try and use debleeding plugins on a bad drum performance, I just end up banging my head against the wall because it doesn't work very well at all. And most of the time you end up just trying to trigger the drums, get replacements in there to really fix the sound, as opposed to being able to use one of these plugins to make it sound a little bit better, because there's only so much that you can do, and the source material is so important to making sure that you can get a good mix. So I'm a big fan of FabFilter plugins. I know they're a little pricey, but so I definitely recommend, when you can, picking up ProMB. It's like a Swiss Army knife compressor. It's so good. And Saturn 2 is an amazing plugin as well. And if you don't own a copy of Silencer yet, check out the description link below. You can grab a copy of it there. Using that link helps support the channel and the time that goes into making these videos. Since I've been using these three plugins, cymbal bleed is just not an issue anymore. I don't even think about it as a problem now. 99% of the time, These 3 plugins will get you out of trouble when it comes to cymbal bleed. Make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Check out the description link below if you want to go to my website, check out my range of drum samples, mix courses, using any of the affiliate links below to get plugins from awesome plugin companies like Kiive Audio, Black Sword Audio, Safari Pedals. If you need AI vocals, use Audimee, it's an amazing site. There's some really cool links below to some awesome plugins and tools that you can use to enhance your music. And also, if you buy your gear online at Sweetwater, consider using the link below when you go and do that. Using that link doesn't cost you anything extra, but a small commission gets kicked back to the channel, and that's a massive support for the time it goes into making videos. And if you're keen to stick around for another video, check out this next one where I'll show you how to EQ a snare to perfection.